Well, good morning. I ask you to open the Bible this morning, book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1 is where we're going to be in our time together this morning. I just want to express my appreciation so much for the opportunity to be with you this morning and talk to you about some things. I appreciate Ryan's sounding endorsement. I don't know what to do with that. That is always good words to get up and talk to a group that's new to you about, and so I appreciate that so very much. Ryan didn't know what to do with the sermon. That's okay. I didn't know what to do with Mother's Day either. So that's why we're talking about Babylon instead this morning. Actually, when Edwin texted me a couple weeks ago for a title, I didn't even think about the fact that today was Mother's Day because I don't think that far ahead. So, but the irony is I'm with my mom today on Mother's Day, which is a joy as well. That doesn't happen very often, and those of you who have adult children know as they go and live their lives and scatter about, those days are precious when you get to be together. So I'm actually thankful I do get to be with Mom on Mother's Day today, even if that's not what we're talking about. Daniel chapter 1 in your Bible this morning. One of the challenges that happens, I think, for those of us who have been around the church and around the Bible a long time, is that familiar stories don't get revisited. Stories that we heard about in Bible classes when we were kids growing up, stories like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We treat them as kids' stories, and we've kind of outgrown them, and we move on to Paul or some of the deep weeds or something. And the problem is, the fact of the matter is, they're good stories for kids. They're great stories for adults. There's a lot more there than often we appreciate or realize sometimes. And so I want to go back this morning with you. Book of Daniel chapter 1, a familiar story, and maybe try to look at it with some fresh eyes this morning. Maybe notice some things going on there that have some application, not just for the kids, but maybe for those of us a little bit older as well. Have your Bible? Daniel chapter 1 this morning. I want to begin reading in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. All right, so what's going on here is it's the year 605 BC, give or take. The Battle of Carchemish has just happened. That's what's going on. The Battle of Carchemish was the last stand of the Assyrian army. They've already lost Nineveh. They'd already been defeated at Haran again in 609. And now the Egyptians, trying to prop up what was left of the Assyrian army at Carchemish, were trying to resist the rising power of Babylon. And so this Assyrian-Egyptian coalition tries and fails at Carchemish in 605 to stop the rising Babylonian power. This is Nebuchadnezzar's coming out party. And so he chases what's left of the Egyptian remnant army all the way back down into Egypt. And as he's going south and going towards Egypt, he's paying courtesy calls on small cities and kingdoms that have perhaps been paying tribute to Assyria up until this point, and letting them know, you make the check out to Babylon now. That's where you send your tribute. I'm the new power in this region, and my name is Nebuchadnezzar. Don't forget it. And so he comes to Jerusalem, and what he does in Jerusalem as a way of sending a message that I am in control here is he takes God's stuff. He takes the temple treasure, stuff that Solomon would have built centuries before and made centuries before when the temple was built. And they also took not just the stuff, they took some of the best of the people. They took some of the royal youths. That would be Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, whom we better know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He'll take some of the best people as well. A little bit of a hostage situation to try to keep the folks in Jerusalem on their best behavior. If you don't like your new overlords, well, we can send a few heads back in the baskets. But also for indoctrination. We'll get to that in just a moment. If you can take the best of the next generation of the people you conquer, and you can convince them that your gods and your ways are better and superior, well, then guess what happens? Those kids write home and say, hey, Mom and Dad, we need to change. It's better here in the big city. And maybe eventually you can even send those kids back home, and they will become sympathetic rulers and participants and spread your culture, your ways to the people back home. And so Jerusalem is besieged. But the big question, if you're a Jew at this point sitting in Jerusalem, the big question that all of this raises is, how did this happen? How did we get to this point? We're God's chosen people. This is God's chosen city. This is God's temple. And now God's stuff is in Nebuchadnezzar's hands. How did this happen? It was a reality check for Israel, folks. It was a reality check for the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had all the great stories of great deliverances, close calls, last minute victories. Assyria had nearly gotten them before in 701 with Hezekiah. And you remember what happens? The angel of the Lord shows up and nearly 200,000 Assyrian soldiers dead. They had had close brushes before, but never had Jerusalem been violated. What a shock that must have been to the Jews of Jehoiakim's day in Jerusalem. It put the reality of Israel in perspective. Folks, we're used to reading the Bible and seeing Israel and Jerusalem as the center of the story. And from God's perspective, they were, but from the world's perspective, they were nothing. It was a small backwater people, a small, relatively small, insignificant city. And this event reminded the inhabitants of Jerusalem of how small and how powerless, in fact, they really were. Just a bunch of rural farmers in a backwater by and large. Jerusalem was a town you drove through in between the great cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was passed through flyover country, and they were besieged, and they were beaten, and they lost their stuff, and they lost their children. As Babylon shows the world who's boss, who's in charge now. Well, listen, that on one level makes Israel look stronger. It makes Babylon look stronger. Makes Babylon look stronger than Israel. Think about it. The way in the ancient world it used to work is when two armies went to war, that was really the gods of the respective peoples going to war against each other. And whichever army wins, that just means their God is stronger. And so if Babylon beats Jerusalem, what does that mean? It means the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is weaker than Marduk, Bel, other Babylonian deities. That's what it means to the eyes of flesh. From the earthly perspective. Babylon's gods now look stronger than Israel's gods. And so you do what you do when your God is stronger than the loser god. You take the loser god's stuff. He's impotent, couldn't protect his own stuff. And so what Babylon is saying to Jerusalem, what Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar are saying to Daniel and his three friends, are that the stuff that you said is holy and sacred and belongs to your God, it's our stuff now. It's our God's stuff now. Your God couldn't keep it. Your God couldn't protect it. The finest of your God now belongs to our God. It's going to Babylonian temples and Babylonian museums, so to speak. It belongs to us and our gods now. And by the way, you guys worship and you pray to a defeated God, a weak God. Makes you look stupid. It makes you look foolish in the world's eyes. You pray to your God. How well did it work out for you this time? Didn't at all. You lost your city. You lost your God's stuff. And folks, that's still how it works today, right? It's the classic problem of evil. When bad things happen to God's people, what does the world say? How'd that praying work out for you? When bad things happen to us, sometimes we begin to say, where was God in that? Why didn't God do something about it? That's the classic problem of evil. But the fact of the matter is, folks, just because something looks like God has failed or God is absent doesn't mean it's true. If there are a bunch of pipes leaking in your home, it doesn't mean there's no plumbers in the world. It just means you didn't handle your business and you didn't call the plumber. That's what it means. The fact that things go wrong in the world does not mean necessarily that there is no God. It could just mean people forgot to relate to God rightly. That's what it might mean. It might mean people don't live the way God said live. That's what it might mean. I mean, after all, at the end of the day, when you stop and you think about it and what's going on here, in the midst of a world in which it seemed like nothing made sense anymore, and Jerusalem has been violated and desecrated, what's really going on here is the text makes very clear in verse 2 that God gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. It was actually God's doing. That might not be what the newspapers and textbooks say. But the book of Daniel wants to make sure we understand that's exactly what happened. This was God's doing. God was actually still in control no matter what it looked like on the ground. And what's interesting is the prophet Jeremiah said as much to the people at the time. We forget sometimes that Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel are all contemporaries. They're all alive at the same time. So great was the rise of Babylon and the fall of Jerusalem to God that he had three prophets active at the same time. Daniel within the Babylonian hierarchy, Ezekiel with the captives who were taken in 598 and beyond, and Jeremiah was God's color commentator for the fall of Jerusalem itself. His man on the ground in the city as it went down. Think about your favorite CNN or Fox News reporter there as it burns. That's Jeremiah. And here's Jeremiah chapter 25 of his book. In the same time, the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah tells us, he's speaking this. And he says to the people, for 23 years up until this first year of Nebuchadnezzar, for 23 years the word of the Lord has come to me. And I spoke to you again and again, but you have not listened. That's why it's happened. And so Jeremiah goes on to explain that thus God now says through him, I send Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. That's an interesting way for God to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, isn't it? My servant. And he will bring against them, against the land and the inhabitants of all these nations, his army, and I will utterly destroy them. That's why God is letting this happen to his people. God makes very clear to his people. When God sends his message and his word, and we ignore it, and we avoid it, and we rationalize it away, and we're good at that, aren't we? When we make life about us and about us and about us, eventually God says, all right, it's all about you then. Good luck with that. You take God out of your life, then you put his blessings in your life at risk. That's what the Bible tells us. You take God out of your life, you put at risk his help, his protection. You don't want his advice, you don't want his solutions. Well, good luck then finding it on your own. That's what's going on. And that's why this has happened. So beginning in verse 3, Daniel and his three friends are in quite the predicament. And the text goes along and says this, as our young brother read to us a moment ago. The king ordered Ashpena, chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. They had ability for serving in the king's court. And so he ordered them to teach them the language and literature of the Chaldeans, and the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of that they would enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel he became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. And folks, what happens now here is we pivot from why it happened to Jerusalem to what happens to these innocent young men. We notice some things that are really important for us about understanding the time and the place that we live in. When you look in verse 4, I want you to notice what Babylon valued. Because that's what it's really about. That's why these young men are chosen. Youths in whom there was no defect, good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. What was Babylon looking for? Well, they were looking for young people. They were looking for beautiful, perfect bodies. They were looking for people who were smart and brilliant. They were looking for people who were able to be used, who were valuable in the system, because the value of the person was determined by how useful they were to the system in which they lived. No inherent human dignity in this. And so that's what Babylon values. That's not that different from today, is it? When you stop and think about it, what does the world want? In Babylon, they wanted youth, beautiful bodies, smart, brilliant, and useful. Aren't you glad that we don't live in a world like that today anymore? You see, folks, in a sense, it's always Babylon out there, isn't it? Oh, the names change, and the times change, and the language changes, and who's in charge changes, and who you write out your tax or tribute check to, that changes. But at the end of the day, the system, the world, it never changes. It's still Babylon out there. And what happens now in the story is basically the Babylonians say to these young men, for 3 years, you're going to go to Babylon U, and we're going to take you, we're going to put you into our system, our higher education system, where we're going to make you in our own image. We're going to bombard you with our ways. We're going to teach you to think like we think, value what we value. We're going to show your religion and your God for the utter foolishness that it is in reality. I mean, after all, what good did your God do for what just happened? Nothing. We now have your God's stuff. You live in our city by our choice. And so we want you to learn to live like we live, learn to think like we think, and therefore act like we act. Because this is how the world works. It's about looks and it's about usefulness, performance. That's what it's all about. That's what life's about. That's how you get your place in the world. And folks, that's still the way it is today, isn't it? Every commercial on TV, every magazine on the rack when you check out at the grocery store, every billboard you drive past, every celebrity photograph. You ever wonder where all the normal people went? Where did all the normal people go? People who look like you and people who look like me, early middle age, receding hairline, etc., etc. Where are those people in the world's image? We don't exist. Because what Babylon, what the world has always wanted, is young, beautiful, useful. And the world takes that, and the world remakes that in its own image. And while it's true, you and I, we can't just go and we can't just build monasteries and hide behind walls until Jesus comes back. We do need to learn to see so much more clearly about what's really going on all around us at school and at work and at the store and at the workplace, that it's all still Babylon trying to make us in its image still today. And it's so common and it's so constant that we get used to it and we forget that that's what's really going on every day. So this story is a place that takes place where we live. It's not just for the kids' classes back in the hall. It's a story for all of us about recognizing the system for where it is, what it is, for recognizing that it's always Babylon versus God, always Babylon against the Bible out there. Babylon which says, look what I've done, versus the Bible which says every good gift you have comes from God, be thankful. Babylon which says, look at me, look at me. The Bible which says, consider others before yourself. Babylon which says, love those who love you or can help you get ahead, versus the Bible that says, that's not true love, even the pagans do that much. Babylon, which says, do whatever you want. It makes you feel good and fulfilled and helps you discover yourself. Versus the Bible, which says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Babylon, which says, get as much as you can, as fast as you can. Versus the Bible that says, give all that you can. Babylon, which says, store up as much treasure for yourself as you can. Versus the Bible, which says, store up treasure in heaven. Do you see this morning how at bottom this age is really no different than ancient Babylon? This age really is in opposition to God and his kingdom, and not just in the bluntly moral things, the thou shalt and thou shalt nots. It's even down to the very manner and purpose of meaning of life itself. Babylon in the Bible is in fact a metaphor for every age and every place the people of God find themselves in. It's always Babylon out there. And that's what we need to understand. And so these young men were chosen because they were young, because they were beautiful, and because they were useful. And that's what it was all about to Babylon. And that's why they were put in the position they were in. And they were taken in and they were sent to the Ivy League of their day. They were sent to Babylon University. They were sent for 3 years. It must have been the British system. They're quicker there. 3 years to study the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Now here's the interesting thing about that, folks. Here's what's interesting about that. Thanks to archaeology, we have a lot of the ancient Babylonian and Chaldean texts. We have some idea of what the language and the literature of these people would have involved. And it would have been a mix of shop class and philosophy and religion. That's what it would have been a mix of. It would have been a mix of practical skills and stuff like glass blowing and other kinds of artisanship, but it would have also been obviously an education in their gods, their myths, their legends. It would have been an education in their religious practices. We have some of their literature. We understand how they saw dream interpretation and how they saw other forms of divination like tearing animals apart and using their insides and entrails to attempt to depict the future. We actually have manuals where you can go and you can read and some translations that are available in the library. And you can for yourself go and look at what that looks like, how to tell the future based upon how you cut up an animal or what kind of dream somebody had last night. And that's what they were taught. And the whole idea, of course, is, and it's always been about controlling the education system to change the world. When you learn our things and come to see the world our way, you will learn to love it. It's so much better than that podunk Farmersville that you came from. This is a life that's worth trading up for. Isn't it true? Those of us who have lived long enough, we've often seen young people go away to school and they begin to think that they know so much more than those who have come before them. Now they're better than the folks back home because they've been to the big city and the big school. They've got the bumper sticker to show it. And that's exactly what Babylon is trying to get these young men to buy into as well. And so we still face this challenge in life, where the world uses its language and its literature to remake us in its own image through its education. But then, not only that, they gave them new names. They gave them new names. Not only do we give you a new culture, a new language, and a new literature, we give you new names. Here's what you have to understand, because most of us just speak English. We're Americans. That's what it means, one language. The reality is their names, Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah, in Hebrew, they all have elements of the name of God in some way in it. They're all God-fearing names. And that's why those names have to go, because the names that they are given all contain the names of Babylonian deities or in some way allude to Babylonian values. And so that's why they change their name. And you sit there and you say, well, name doesn't mean that much. What's the big deal about that? Think about the power of names to this day. I mean, and once it's even in the Bible, remember, God thought names were important. Abram's name doesn't fit anymore. It needs to be changed to Abraham, as we say in good American. Abraham, that's what his name needs. He needs to be father of a nation, not just father, because I'm going to keep this promise to him. Come down to this day, listen, in the brave new world that we live in, you think names don't matter? Call somebody by the wrong pronoun and see what happens. Names matter. Names matter a lot. And so Babylon, again, knows what it's doing. See, and we're still playing that game today, aren't we, in our own way, even in our own culture right now? And so Babylon says, we're going to change your name. You need names that fit our world, our place, our values. They fit your new life because you're going to live in our world and you're going to love it. So what's really interesting about that, though, is this last thing, that they were allowed the king's choice food. They were allowed the king's choice food. We tend to think when we wrestle with that, we know what's going to happen here in just a moment in verse 8. That's where Daniel draws the line. Daniel draws the line over not eating the king's choice food and wine. And we wonder why that is when you stop and think about it. I mean, I don't know about you, but wouldn't you think Daniel might have had a problem going to school and learning that stuff? Maybe Daniel might have a problem being called by that name, yet in Daniel chapter 4, he actually answers to that name, that pagan name that he was given. You might have thought the place to draw the line was over the education itself or over the name, but that's not where Daniel chose to draw his line. He drew his line not in the classroom or in the dorm. He drew it in the cafeteria. Why? Why there? Well, sometimes we want to look at this whole, the king's choice food angle, and we look at it and we say, well, maybe it was, surely Babylonian food wouldn't have been up to Levitical standards. Remember, Leviticus, very particular about what you can and what you can't eat. Part of the problem with that idea, though, in this context is, why would he refuse the wine? There's no limits on the wine in Leviticus. Yet the wine is not acceptable either. What's the deal here? The deal here is in a little word that's actually used here. This is not the normal original language word for food that's used here in Daniel chapter 1. It's an extremely rare word. In fact, it's actually most likely a Persian loan word. It's really not Hebrew or Aramaic at all. Patbag. And what patbag means is something more like loyalty food. It's the food you eat when you say, I'm good with this. I accept this. I'm on board with this. I affirm this. I acknowledge this. I will be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and this new regime. We see something like this a little bit later on in Daniel chapter 6. Again, a very rare word, which is why it's odd it appears twice in this little book. In Daniel chapter 11, it's the middle of a vision. The vision is odd. That doesn't concern us this morning, what's going on in this vision, except to note this, that in the context there of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 26, one king is betraying another king in the context of this vision. And part of the treachery of that betrayal, of breaking that alliance, is those who eat his choice food will destroy him. That those who have eaten one king's loyalty food will then turn on him. They've eaten patbag and now they're not faithful. That's outrage. That's treachery. It's one thing to go to war. It's another thing to break somebody that you've said, I'm loyal to. I'm on your team. And that seems to be what's really going on here. Why did Daniel draw the line where he did? He basically is saying, listen, I have no problem. I have no problem going and learning about your ways and your culture. I have no problem showing I understand your religion and your myths and your legends. I have no problem learning how you think dreams work and how you think tearing up animals tells the future. I'll learn that. I'll pass tests and show you I understand what you think and what you believe. And call me whatever you want, whatever. You call me whatever you want. You call me son, God, boy, or whatever makes you feel good. That's fine. But But when you ask me ultimately to start affirming this, saying, I'm on Team Nebuchadnezzar, I'm part of Babylon, when you ask me to eat the king's choice food, I can't do that. And that's why in the context, when you keep reading, the minister of Babylon who was assigned to give out the rations got nervous. Because this wasn't just he was insulting Nebuchadnezzar's mother's favorite recipe for this. It was because the servant understood symbolically what Daniel and his friends were saying. And Daniel and his friends did well. The text makes it very clear they excelled the natives at their school. That's the worst part of it all. They were more Chaldean than the Chaldeans. But when Daniel pushes the tray back in the cafeteria and says, I can't affirm this, I'm not part of this, well, the whole tone of the story changes at that point. It was a big deal when you don't eat what the king offers you. Another examples of this even in the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 20, when Saul began to wonder about David's loyalty was when David didn't show up to the meal. And so Daniel says, sorry, Nebuchadnezzar, I can't affirm you. As we'd say today, I'm not an ally. I can't do that. I can understand you, I can listen to you, I can show that I get where you're coming from, but I will not affirm this. Do what you need to do. And so here we have ultimately the story of a young teenager. Couldn't have been more than that at this point in the story. If he's still alive in Daniel chapter 6 and you do the math, he can't be more than a teenager, folks. A young man stands up to the greatest empire of the day that the world has yet seen. And it's interesting how they do it too. They weren't obnoxious about it. There were no protests. There was no sit-ins, no petition drives. They were almost a courtesy when you look at how they speak to those who were in charge of them. They just simply said, just watch how we live and see what you think. Make your own decision. And so again, folks, we need to understand at the end of the day that values aren't what you say on Sunday. They're what you do Monday through Saturday. And the risk you're willing to take and the price you're willing to pay to be faithful to what you say you believe in this place on Sunday. And so again, here's Daniel, call me whatever you want, teach me whatever you want me to know, I'll take the test, I'll pass your test, but that's not who I am. And when you ask me to eat, you're asking me to change who I am. You watch how I live and you make up your own mind. And that's how we still live today, folks. It's always Babylon out there. And so you and I, as the world more and more around us, more and more loses its mind and loses its way, you and I more and more are going to have to decide before we go into the boardroom, the workroom, the classroom. Young people, before you go and set foot into somebody else's house or apartment, you got to decide where you're going to draw the line and what price you're willing to pay. Because the truth of the matter is, folks, we come to God because we so often just want the salvation, the blessings, and deliverance. And what the Bible tells us over and over again is what God wants is loyalty. And so when Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel, basically, now comes the loyalty test, eat. Daniel says, I'll learn your ways, but I'm not your man. My loyalty goes to my God back in Jerusalem. The system is what I may have to live within, but I will not be shaped by your system. And because of their courage and their commitment, God used Daniel and those three young men in the stories that follow. We know the stories. But what's powerful about that is even though God aided their efforts, I mean, that's the irony. By chapter 2, Daniel's interpreting their dreams better than any of the locals could. And he's the outsider. And he can actually do it. He didn't even need a textbook. Well, that's what happens when the Spirit of God comes upon you for this kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is, folks, in chapter 1, Daniel and his friends didn't know what would happen. And in Daniel chapter 3, go back and read it for yourself this afternoon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't know whether or not God would preserve them in the fire. They admit as much to Nebuchadnezzar. They just say, we're willing to die for this. You and I don't know how our story will end when we make our choice. But that doesn't change what the issue is, what the dynamic is, and what's at stake for us in it. Folks, it's always Babylon out there. And so the end of the story seems like a happy ending on one level. It seems like a happy ending. God delivers them, and we get all the way through, and Daniel gets to die of old age. In chapter 6, even the lions won't touch him. But the fact of the matter is it only looks like a happy ending on one level, because I think if you were to ask Daniel at any point in the story, starting in chapter 1 all the way to chapter 6 and all the decades in between, if God had ever come to him in a dream at night and said, Daniel, you've been loyal, what do you want in return? You know what I think Daniel would have said? I want to go home. And that never happened. Because often the way God uses his people is the consequence for loyalty is greater responsibility, greater usefulness, more public witness to who God is and what God wants. So what do you and I do with an old children's story that actually hits a lot closer to home than maybe you and I realize? Let me make 3 quick points, and we'll be through for our time together this morning, because it is always babbling out there. Number 1, you need to decide that you belong to God. You need to decide that right now. You need to decide that you belong to God. You need to ask yourself, am I just following God because of the perks, or am I serving God because I'm loyal? Because if you're only serving God for the perks, when the day of testing comes, you're not going to stand. It's about loyalty, not about convenience. Number 2, you need to understand that you need to live the implications of that decision in every sphere of your life, all day, every day, financially, sexually, relationally, all spheres of life under God's values, loyalty to him. And number 3, then you need to live the implications of that decision, no matter what happens in the world. Because so often, folks, we get into this whole, I come to God when I get into trouble, and God's going to bail me out, and God's going to solve my problems, and that's what I'm looking for, and that's what I'm hoping for, and that's why I'm here maybe even this morning. And so whenever that happens, then the problem of evil rears its head, right? When I do everything I'm supposed to and things still don't work out, what will happen? We get bitter, we get angry. Where's God in that? Maybe you're here this morning and you're saying, listen, I've done what I'm supposed to do. I've read Ephesians 5. I've read 1 Peter 3. I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do in my marriage, but it's not gotten better. It's gotten worse. Let me ask you something this morning. Are you following God because he's Lord, or because you want him to do what you want him to do? Maybe you're here this morning and you've gone through a hard time financially in the past year with all the COVID and the economic slowdown, and maybe you're sitting there this morning saying, oh, Jeff, I've done what I'm supposed to do, but my financial situation is not getting any better. In fact, actually, it's getting worse. Let me ask you something this morning. Is God just a genie where you rub the lamp and get your wishes to you? Or is he the creator of the universe who's used to giving orders, not taking them to you? How do you see God this morning? Because at the end of the day, these guys follow God because he's God. It's that simple. Full stop, end of discussion. They follow God because he's God. Their city has been defeated. Their temple has been pillaged. They are captives, and they follow him. Why? Not because it always works out in this life. They follow him because he's God. And they don't get to go home, and they don't get released for their faithfulness. And even then, you can only imagine in Babylon, the world still looking at them and saying, you keep praying to that little God of yours all you want. It doesn't work. We still have your temple treasures. We still own you. We still own your land. You still write the checks to us. Come on, just give it up. Be like us. Because that's how the system works. The system wants looks. It wants youth. It wants people who are useful. And it judges everything by the immediate results and appearances. But God still wants people today who will not be tainted by the world. We may live here, but we will not be conformed by the spirit of the age. We may live here, but our loyalty is to the God of heaven. And so God help us to maintain that kind of commitment in a world that still, in so many ways, whether it's the school place or the workplace or any other place, still desperately wants to remake us in our own image. If COVID ever ends enough that you can go back to Europe and not quarantine for 2 weeks or whatever it is now, you can go to Berlin and you can go to the Pergamum Museum and you can see this. This is the Ishtar Gate. Nebuchadnezzar built it. It's partly the ancient one and partially a reconstruction. The Germans have it in Berlin. And the Ishtar Gate was built by Nebuchadnezzar himself during this era, during Daniel's lifetime. It was kind of one of their great ceremonial gates. It was their parade ground. You've seen some of the triumphal arches in Rome that you go to see when you go to Rome. This was the Babylonian version of that. That was where they celebrated their greatness and their victory. It's a beautiful and wonderful thing to look at. And to this day, though, what's interesting to my mind is this. This is still how the world wants us to remember Babylon. You go to the museum and you see it in its glory. You see it in its splendor, at its height, and at its greatness. But the truth about the Ishtar Gate is this, that this is how they found it. This is the truth about Babylon. And if you want to take your life in your hands, you can still, to this day, go to the Iraqi desert and go to this place and see what Babylon really is. Not the museum mankind version, but the what God hath wrought against Babylon version. Because even back before Babylon was ever the great power, Isaiah in his day in chapter 13 and verse 19 prophesied of what would happen in the distant future for Isaiah. That Babylon, glory of kingdom, splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. And it will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. Wild animals, in fact, will lie down there. The houses will be full of howling creatures. The ostriches will dwell, and their wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in the towers, jackals in the pleasant places. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. Because that's how it always ends for Babylon. You see, Peter understood. In fact, Peter read the Daniel story the same way we're talking about this morning. That's why when he, writing from Rome in 1 Peter chapter 5, says, she who was in Babylon, in other words, me and the other Christians with me, greet you other Christians that we're writing to, we greet you. We who are in Babylon. You see, whether it's literal Babylon, or whether it's later Susa, or whether it's Athens, or whether it's Rome, or whether it's London, or whether it's New York or D.C., from God's perspective, it's always Babylon. And Peter got it. He said, that's how we read the Bible. That's how we read the story. It's really just one story. Just keep on changing the names. It's just one story over and over again. Keeps on repeating itself. And so Peter's advice as he wrote to Christians still living in a Babylonian captivity of sorts, in which we are still pushed to become like Babylon and affirm our allyship with Babylon. Peter says, I urge you, beloved, as sojourners and exiles, that's what we are too, folks, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. I can't imagine the pressure that Daniel and those three young men were under, waging war on their soul those years as they had all of that pushed on them. And yet Peter reminds us to see ourselves in the exact same way, no matter how comfortable you are, how convenient your life has been, that from God's perspective, we are still his people in Babylon, fighting to keep our minds and our hearts truly his. God help us to that end. So what we're going to do now this morning is we're going to sing a song, and this song is your opportunity if you need to come out of your exile of living in the world and become one of God's people in the first place. This song is your opportunity to come and share, you confess your faith in Jesus before those gathered here this morning, and repenting or repudiating your participation in Babylon, the world. We'll baptize you for forgiveness of your sins this morning. Maybe you're here this morning, you're a child of God already, and maybe your heart's troubling you right now. Maybe you realize that you're more Babylonian than Christian, and you need to do something about that. If there's something on your mind and your heart, we can pray with you, for you, hold you accountable in some way. Why don't you come talk to us about it right now while we stand, while we sing.